So you're probably thinking, hey, things are looking pretty good right now in the economy. You probably heard in the headlines that right now the jobless rate is at a 49-year low, and look at that Dow. The Dow has increased steadily since 2014, although it did drop 800 points yesterday. So. And I mean, shoot, the Chiefs are bound for the Super Bowl, right? So things are looking up. Oh yeah, that's the jinx. But we're not talking about today. We're we're talking about 15 to 18 months from now. And boy, the economists are really struggling with what's going to happen next year. It goes back and forth. But many of the finance directors in the major municipalities are convinced that there will be a recession sometime between 2020, 2021, or 2022. So the best thing that we can do as policymakers is to plan for it, in case it does happen. So now the reason we're projecting a recession, which, by the way, the recession isn't like it was last time. It is predicted to be a slowdown in the growth rate. So for the past 60 years, there's one indicator that you just can't overlook, and it's the difference between the interest rate on 10-year bonds and the interest rate on 2-year Treasury bonds. And that difference, if it reaches a negative position, it's called a negative or an inverted yield curve. And once you have an inverted yield curve, then a recession happens between 12 and 18 months afterwards. And so right now, this is a chart from 2006 to now. And that's where the recession hit last time. And that's when that inverted yield curve occurred, sometime in the end of 2000, I can't read it, 7? So, and then the recession started. So this is what's happened since then. And now we're at 0.34. So we're all expecting that yield curve to end up being a negative at some point in the next 6 months. And then we anticipate a recession 12 to 18 months later after that. So, and by the way, so here's since 1985, and each one of these grays is a recession. So there is the inverted yield curve, there's an inverted yield curve, there's another one. So it's time to make some plans. It's also been about 10 years since the recession occurred, and the normal business cycle, has a recession every 8 to 10 years. So just a little art to keep things lively here. It's from our murals in downtown. Now, so as policymakers, it's important for us to anticipate these sorts of economic slowdowns, as I mentioned, because we need to plan ahead. Now, why do we plan ahead? We plan ahead mainly because the government actually makes up a significant portion of our regional economy. So we want to make sure we're not going to contribute to the slowdown by having to lay off people. And so the government makes up all of the school districts and other jurisdictions or other municipalities in the county, make up 17% of the total jobs in the county. So we need to anticipate that slowdown for that reason. Another reason is that maintaining the continuity of our delivery of services is very important to our residents. Also, avoiding economic shock safeguards us against fiscal distress. And that's actually finance director speak for keeping your reserves, appropriate. And then lastly, once we reach the end of that recession, we'd be in a better position to rebound out of it if we plan ahead for it. So, all right. So that the whole reason we're planning, the first step is to do a forecast and see where we are. And Doug asked me to summarize some of the assumptions that I used for the forecast. Actually, we all worked on this as a team, including Mike Grimm, who was our research manager. And so what I'm predicting is a, yeah, it's, we got a little bit of a dip starting in 2022 on the CPI. Unemployment's dipping around that time too. You see how it's dipping here. It kind of jumps up a little bit again, and then it stays pretty constant. The housing price index, that's kind of a tough one to call because there's a lag in housing prices. So they don't react as quickly as, say, sales taxes do when you get into a recession. But I've got it dropping rather than growing. I have it dropping by 4% or 1.4% in 20 and 0.5% in 21, and then rebounding back to an average growth rate in the latter years. The same is, for the most part, true for the county jobs. This is an important one. As I mentioned, there is always kind of a lag in housing prices or the assessed value. And so I have assessed value growing by 4% in the first year of the forecast, then dropping during the recessionary period, and then rebounding to 4, and then an average of 2.9 in the last year. So, you know, these are all just kind of assumptions. And of course, any kind of modest change in any of these can make a big difference in the forecast. But this just reflects that there's a lag that happens with the housing prices. It's not going to happen in 2020. It's going to wait a year. The delinquency rate, by the way, is it's pretty high, you would think, but it includes the fact that we expect to make refunds related to the housing or related to the refund of Hollywood Casino. Average growth rate for personal property, average growth rate for BPU revenue growth, and then sales tax we have dropping by, the growth is only at 1.5%, and then it's 4% showing a rebound in the third year, and then kind of an average rate in the outer years. Okay? So how does that impact our revenues? So this forecast is only showing you kind of the difference between the revenues and the expenditures going forward. So this is the revenues. We're not going to talk about current fund balance, in other words. So now I'm gonna leave these the revenue slides are going to be taken by Debbie Johnson.
Good evening. So this is the revenue forecast showing our budget year of 2019. This is as it was approved. And then we have the forecast for 20 through 2024. As Kathleen talked about the anticipated recession, the revenue estimates do reflect modest decreases in the 20 and 21 growth rates impacted by the anticipated recession. You can see that in 2020, we have total revenues at $224 million, and that's about an increase of 2.6% or $5.6 million over the 2019 budget amounts. The 2021 through 2024, those increases are in the 2 to 3% ranges for each of those years. Property tax, in 2019, we're at about just under $62 million. And we jumped to 64 million in 2020, which is about a 4% increase. And then we have 2.9% increases for the outer years until we get to 2023, and then it jumps back up to about 4%. For sales tax, we've got for 2020 and 2021, we've estimated about a 1.2% increase, and then a 2 to 3% increase in the outer years. For franchise taxes, it's about 2.5% for all of the forecasted years. And then charges for service is about 4.3% in the first year, and then 2 to 3% in the next years. So I just gave the percentages for the top 4 general fund revenues. They account for about 80% of total general fund revenues. Property tax is the orange line. And you can see that it represents 28% of general fund revenues In 2019, it was at 61.7, and then in 2024, it's up to about 74 million. Franchise tax is the green line. It represents 21% of general fund revenues, and between 2019 and 2024, it jumps from 55 million to about, 45 million to about 51. The yellow line is sales tax, which represents about 25% of general fund revenues. In 2010, sales tax only represented 17% of general fund revenues, but with the influx of money from the revenue from the STAR bond payoff, that has now increased the sales tax revenue to 25%. And then charges for service is 6% of general fund revenues, with just a very modest increase from 13 million in 2019 to 15 million in 2024. And I'm going to turn it back over to Kathleen.
So on the expenditure side, the largest expenditure is salaries and benefits, which begins at $160 million in the current year budget and increases to $183 million or $184 million in 2024, and which is, so overall, year over year, the expenditures are increased at a modest level, some of them depending on what the category is and what category best correlates with what economic indicator. But as I mentioned, the largest increase is in salaries and benefits, and that's where all our focus was on. In the prior forecast, we did not include any kind of annual compensation cost of living adjustment, but in this one we have. So that increase is, a moderate increase that year over year in order to reflect that cost. That we know we need to build into our forecast in order to remain competitive with our neighboring local governments. So the other thing that is also included in here is an annual 7% increase in healthcare costs, healthcare claims. We are self-insured. 7% is a moderate increase. It doesn't reflect any huge claims, but it's an average over many years. And then another big thing is cost of living the increases for pension payments, which our pension estimate includes, it's relative to the increase in salaries. We're not projecting any kind of pension actuarial assumption changes in the forecast. So the biggest increase to the cost of salary and benefits is actually the estimate we have put in place for what they call leave payouts and KPNF special payments, which I'm going to get into in a minute. But over time, and we've done an estimate year over year of the expected number of retirees we anticipate will be needing to make payments out for, and those have been included in this estimate. Okay. So again, the top four are salary and benefits, way up here on the top. And salary and benefits represent 73% of the total expenditures in 2020. Any other? Yeah, so I've already covered these items. So the big payouts are that silver tsunami that I mentioned a couple years ago. And that's the expectation that all those baby boomers are now approaching retirement age or in the middle of, are retiring on us. So anyone born before 1964 is a baby boomer and part of the silver tsunami. So today's projection, a couple years ago, back in February 17, we did some projections. So for fun, we're gonna compare with how our projections from a year and a half ago with what actually happened. But this slide actually is what we project to happen in the future. The thing is, we have quite a few that are eligible to retire, but we anticipate far fewer are going to retire for various reasons. So the eligible number between 2018, this year, and 2024 is 615. but we actually expect only 412 to retire in that 6-year period, which represents 17% of our workforce. So, and here they are year over year. Here's the eligible, and then here's the expected. And part of that is because many, especially in the civilian category, many of those retirees will hit their eligibility prior to turning 65, but they elect to stay on and continue to work until they're 65 in order to get qualified for Medicaid. So that's part of the big difference. You can see that 344 compared to what we expect, which is 205. The sheriff's department is, yeah, that's a big reason there. And the fire department, we expect that they will gradually retire once they hit their retirement eligibility, but the police will, based on our observation, will likely retire within a year or two of hitting their eligibility. So this is just based on observing what has happened in the past with retirees. So last year, or in February 2017, we projected that there would be 566 eligible, and I actually included, some of these years are a little different. The eligible was between 17 and 22, but the expected is between 17 and 2023, all right? And I expected that 560 or 308 would be eligible within the first 1 to 2 years, but then I later expected that to be at only 106 for the same similar reasons as I mentioned previously. But what actually happened was, for example, in 17, we had 42 retirees paid out where I had predicted 50. And so far, year to date, we've had 53 where I predicted 56. So for a total for that 2-year period of 92 instead of 106. So, we're pretty close on our predictions. So, and we just wanted to point this out that these payments are happening and we are legally required to make them. So they contribute a significant portion, again, of this total number right here. See, 2 million, 1.1 million, and then, depending on the timing, they go up, right? Any questions on that? So now we're going to jump into the capital outlay kind of section, and then we're also going to talk about debt. Debbie's going to talk about debt. Just want a reminder that, of the total expenditures, we do pay out in cash. Roughly this capital outlay amount includes projects, cash-funded projects, and equipment. Roughly about $6.6 to $7 million a year. And these are all based on the current approved CMIP, right? And then the out year is just an estimate because we haven't done that year yet, all right? So another thing I wanted to point out is that, well, in this current 19 year, which it begins in January, we have $3.1 million in equipment budgeted, $1.4 million in telecommunications, and $1.9 million in public building improvements, with the remainder going for bridge and park improvements and parking lots and other capital contingencies. We've also included, not in this general fund, but over in our city bonded interest fund, we've included $13.5 million in city debt funded projects for 19. So generally speaking, capital costs, they pay for street infrastructure, which is typically debt financed, and then other maintenance and rehab is found in other outside parts of the general fund, such as the dedicated street, dedicated sales tax, or the special highway fund, etc. So, all right. Debbie's going to talk about the debt profile now.
So this first graph that we're going to look at is the city debt service, and it shows the current bond issues that we have outstanding. We talked a little bit about this. We went over the debt section during, I think, both the CMIP meetings that we had back in June as well as during the budget. And these issues are the same as what we presented there. However, we have adjusted our revenue totals a little bit for our new estimates that we've included for the recession. So the red line that's going across is the revenue estimates that we have. In 2019, we had about a 4.2% increase built in for the revenues. But then you see here that that number drops, whereas the graph that we showed you back during the budget, the graph did not drop, but we've lowered those estimates a little bit due to the recession estimates that we built in. So that does drop there. And then the outer years, we have 2.9% growth built in to the revenue. So this graph just shows the current issues that are outstanding. I will note that the forecast that we're showing estimates that current resources are sufficient to support all the capital infrastructure that we have in the plan. This next graph is going to show this shows the current debt, plus we have built in additional debt into the outer years. We're estimating that we built in $15 million per year. Now you will notice that in 2020, expenses do exceed revenues by a small amount. I think it's about 1.3 to 1.5 million here. But we do believe that we have reserves that can cover that, or if our revenue estimates are more conservative and come in a little bit higher, it would be able to cover that. I will note that also built in, this is showing total debt for the city, which includes the enterprise fund debt. And so we have the enterprise fund revenue also built in to these totals.
Debbie, I want to be clear. So when it says plus 15 million annual new money in out years,
Yeah.
currently we are putting $15 million to capital
That's correct.
bonding. So you've added that in. And based upon this projection, even with those additional infrastructure outlays moving out to the future, there is sufficient revenues generated to cover.
Right.
Okay. But does that include, for instance, the stormwater project, the
in the future, I think in the future, I don't think we built. The 15 million is just for the tax-supported debt in the future. The total graph here includes the sewer debt that we've already issued, but the future projections only look at the tax-supported debt.
Can I make a comment? So on the stormwater, what we wanted to point out is any kind of stormwater is typically an enterprise. So if we're hoping to fund a capital infrastructure improvement plan for our stormwater needs, it's typical to support that with either 100% or a portion from stormwater fees.
So the fees would cover that?
Yes.
Right.
Yes.
Okay, thank you.
So then the next graph is the county debt service fund. So the same graph, this is the county bond issues that are already outstanding, and the revenue projections that we have also built in at 2.9%. I will note that you don't see the dip in 2020 here that you saw on the city side, and the reason for that is when we went through the budget, we talked about the importance of having the savings transfer from the county general fund to fund the debt service for the juvenile center. And we have that built in 2019 at $1 million per year. In the outer years, we have built in $1.3 million as an estimate. So that is built into this revenue number here at $1.3 million going out into the future. I will note that the county mill levy is 2.195, which gives us about 2.8 million in tax revenue. But we also have, there's also other revenues, the PBC revenue, as well as some reimbursements on some of the other debt that also go into this fund to account for the revenues. The next graph shows we've added in, there's about 10 million in additional debt in 2019 and 2020 that was approved as part of the CMIP. So this has added in that debt into the projections. And we also have the same issue here in about 2021. We are creeping up a little bit over the line, over the revenue estimates. But once again, we believe that we have reserves within the fund that will cover that. And if our projections are conservative, then we wouldn't expect to see that gap. But with both funds, if you see that with the projected additional debt, you don't start seeing the gap between the revenue and expenses until you get to about 2024. And this includes no additional debt built in beyond the $10 million that's built in for 2019 and 2020.
Any questions on the debt? I know you have some. Brian.
Commissioner McKiernan.
So we're estimating adding additional debt every year, but we don't ever show that projection layered on. We show the projected income to pay for that, but we never show the projected additional expense necessary. So the last thing you have on this is the, 2020?
Well, so actually, the county one's not a good one to look at.
Pick any one of them.
Yeah.
They all do the same, that you show a gap.
Yeah.
So
No, we do have the out year.
This one has an additional 15 million in new projects built in each year all the way out.
Yeah, you can see 2038, there's another 15 million.
okay, so city does, but county doesn't.
Well, no, because we don't really have any, we don't typically borrow.
That's it, thank
Set
you.
amount for county. Yeah. We just put in what's already programmed in, nothing additional for the county.
So to get to, I think maybe Commissioner McKiernan's,
So there's some capacity, in other words,
that's it.
county.
We have, in other words, currently we're borrowing 15 million a year, putting that on. That's shown in the graph. That shows some room for additional capital expenditures bonded.
Well, at some point in 2024, you probably could borrow more than 15 a year, because you see how there's a room.
Right.
And you could definitely borrow more than 15 a year beginning in 2030.
So that's what,
Right.
I would just go on record again as saying I would prefer that we do not do that we do not suck up any available gap with additional debt. I don't think we should do that. I think we should be retiring debt and not adding just because there is capacity to add. So.
and I would, go ahead.
I would concur with that, and my concern is if we have issues that arise, we're trying to build our reserves, we're trying to meet our reserve projection. We looked at the 25% or the 3 months, and we're looking at just under 17 2 months. So that is actually a non-funded reserve, that area, the capacity on the top. If we needed to, under emergency circumstances, we would have that money available.
We could divert a portion of the mill rate that is currently dedicated to this fund to the general fund and build the reserves. Yes, that's true. But we can't do
And/or
it.
accelerate paying down the debt. Now, the only point I would make, Commissioner, is if there were an opportunity, so for instance, if there were some capital expenditure, a redevelopment, an area that we would say, if we were to invest in this way, in this place, it would act as a catalyst for further development, then I think we would make the case at that point that we might want to do this. But the inclination would be to continue to pay down the debt.
Agreed.
Okay. All right, so now we're going to kind of show you how those revenues and expenditures compare with each other, right? And so this is the long-term financial forecast. And, let's just assume that we're starting 19 or ending 19 without any fund balance, right? Right now we're projecting that at the end of 2019, we're going to have exactly 16.7%, which is 2 months of operating expenditures. So let's not, so starting from ground zero, how is this gonna look going forward? We got, our revenues here, and then our expenditures in the second line, which if you take revenues minus expenditures, you end up with these negative numbers here on an annual basis. So remember that these expenditures include those costs for the silver tsunami, for our retiree payments. So those retiree payments over this 5-year period total $18.6 million. And as you can see, these negatives all add up to $19.5 million. So, I mean, it's pretty close. The amount we have to pay out in retiree payments of 18.6 with the amount that we're short over the 5-year period of 19.5. So it is having a tremendous impact on us. Luckily, in the out years following 2024, those payments are really going to go down quite a bit. But right now, we're just looking at the first 4 years, right? So graphically speaking, this is how our fund balance would look if all my assumptions are correct, and which no assumptions are naturally. There's always you always have to keep in mind that every forecast is wrong about 5 minutes after you present it. So, but for the most part, the whole point is to try and plan ahead. So, and we want to keep our fund balance at that 40 million roughly level, or at least within the 16.7% level. So see, there's the 16.7 level right there in 2019. We'd like to keep our fund balance right where that 2019 number is. So, but unfortunately, we're projecting it's going to be diving down. Now, we broke this up. That's the consolidated general fund. We broke this up by city and county. And the impact of the silver tsunami impacts the city much greater than it does the county. So the county actually is coming out of this okay at the end of the forecast period, but the city's hitting down in the 2.5% level. So, yeah.
The red line is,
Well, the red line's sort of like a trend line. So, and that's the percentage. So over here is the percentage, right? And then over here is dollars. There's 2 axes here.
yeah. So what you're saying, what the base is showing is that we're going to be depleting our reserve fund to cover the expenditures for the silver tsunami.
That's, yeah, if we take no other action.
We take no other action.
Yeah.
But that we will be able to cover even if we take no further action.
True, that is true, yes.
Except that we'll deplete the reserve fund.
Well, and part of having a reserve fund, actually,
So you can do that.
is so you can handle one-time things, but also so you can weather a recession. But it would probably be better if we maybe did some actions on the front end to plan to build our reserves so that it doesn't get down to this low level.
Correct.
Since we have 18 months to plan for it.
And the, any additional expenditures or outlays that we'd have to make due to a recession, is that programmed into this as well?
Well, we've anticipated increases, say, in fuel in those areas, but we haven't, any kind of impacts as a result of, say, additional homelessness or those sorts of social impacts would probably be reflected in areas outside of these funds. We're not projecting increased costs as relate to additional crime or no. So, maybe marginally we're reflecting additional costs.
Okay. But we also aren't accounting for reduction in revenues from sales tax.
We are, yes, that is reflected,
Okay,
yeah.
yes.
An increase in savings from higher interest rates for monies that we have in reserves and in CDs and what I would call short and long-term investments.
Yeah, I did increase our investment yield on, we earn about $1.2 million in the general fund in investment earnings, so that's going up by about 5%. Yeah, yeah. But that's the quandary with, that finance directors all face, is that during bad times, our revenues are cut, but our expenses even get higher, so. So they asked me to put this chart here. You kind of like to see how the revenues and the expenditures correspond with each other. So this kind of light blue line is the variance. The red is the baseline expenditure. And then the black is the revenue. So you can see how our revenues are higher than our expenditures. So there's a gap there. But the gap narrows in 2024. And as I mentioned, that's because our retiree payouts are improving. Mm-hmm. Okay. Any questions? All right, now the one. So I could have done a 10-year forecast, and maybe it would have been a little more positive because things do look better in the next 5 years. But now, of course, as I mentioned, the amount, the forecast can vary. So I provided here. This is the forecast. This is how the forecast looks if my revenue estimates are 1% lower, higher than than what I projected. So this dotted line is what I projected, and then the bars show what the fund balance is if my revenue estimates are 1% off. So
If your estimates are 1% more than actually show up, or 1%
my estimate
less?
is less.
1%.
That's why this dotted line is below the bars.
Okay.
And then if my revenue estimates are overly, or my estimates are overly optimistic, then it goes down even further. This is fund balance right here. So, there's some variation. I'm not claiming, of course, to try to perfectly time the recession or to know exactly what number we're going to achieve, 18 months from now. But just to give you a range. All right, so as I mentioned, there's some potential risks with forecast. Namely, there's geopolitical and other economic risks, such as changes in trade policy, or that may potentially impact industries in our area and job growth. And the economy really impacts certain revenues that are very sensitive, like sales tax. Also, right now, our labor negotiations one is expiring the end of this year, and then the other 12 are expiring at the end of next year. And so that labor negotiation process is going to be beginning in earnest. And we have projected a modest cost of living increase, which is probably not as much as what the labor groups would like to see. And then naturally, these retiree payouts, I'm using an assumption of when I think they're going to retire, but they may elect to do something else depending on whatever timing or issues. The litigation costs, we have $853,000 budgeted in the current general fund for these sorts of settlements, but boy, those could come in higher than that, couldn't they? Okay. And then the last thing that we always want to keep in mind, and we always mention, is that the unified government still has an outstanding liability of $173 million in pensions and $82 million in retiree health unfunded liabilities, which is a difficult challenge. But I actually have a couple of ideas which we discuss in the report. So generally speaking, in the report, I talk about a couple of proposals. One of them has to do with our current review of the cost or service delivery costs, which we're hoping to analyze using our new tool, priority-based budgeting, and you're going to hear a lot more about that in the future. We do plan to bring forward to the Economic Development Committee a revision to the debt policy for your comment and feedback, and we are working closely with our financial advisor on revising the debt policy. So that'll be a long process, and we, want to get feedback from everyone, and there's no hurry, but we just want to make sure that it reflects what the strategies and comments and thoughts of the commission. And then the last thing is, we really have in place an idea to begin building a fund so that we can start little by little to start accumulating resources to replace our equipment costs in the future. So this is we're almost at the end here. We're going to end with this slide here almost. I think there's one more slide, but these are what the administration believes are, for the most part, the funding strategy or the strategic funding priorities of the commission. These are areas of funding that do not have a revenue source, but we know how important they are to you as a commission. So the first one we've listed here, they're not in any priority order, by the way. So, and the estimates are very, they're very preliminary. The Parks Master Plan, we received the report from the consultant in 2017, and I have put together a preliminary pro forma of how we could pay for that master plan within a potential revenue source, but we expect lots of future discussion on this proposal. But overall, it costs about $5 million a year in operating expenses to augment our current parks and recreation operations, and then about $42 million in additional capital needs. And this includes bringing up to standard our current facilities, but also adding facilities to address the future growth. So we also have a downtown YMCA that we're looking at. We have been talking about for a couple of years. And the commitment from the unified government to build that YMCA would be roughly $650,000 in operating costs annually and a $6 million general obligation bond commitment. The third thing is, follows that data-driven street preservation presentation that the Public Works Department gave several weeks ago. And in order to bring our pavement management index up to, I think it's 65. I think he said it would cost us an additional $20 million per year. So right now we spend $4 million a year. We need another $20 million a year. So 20 times 10 is $200 million. Deferred maintenance, we would need $15 million per year in order to bring our existing facilities back up over the next 10 years. We asked the Public Works Department to give us the cost of any new facilities that would meet growing service demand. At this point, we can only really think about the animal shelter. But we have hired a consultant to do an assessment of our facilities, and so that number is likely to be larger than $10 million. And then, as the mayor mentioned, there's stormwater infrastructure needs. The current stormwater plan has $46 million of both operating and capital needs over the next 10 years. And this last point I just want to point out. So in the long range forecast, I don't know, maybe page 40-ish or so, there's a graph that shows our total FTE, full-time equivalency. So over the past 4 or 5 years, we have not increased our FTE very much at all. And this is a UG-wide discussion here, so not just the general fund. So it stayed in the range of 3.9 to 4 full-time equivalents for every 1,000 residents, every 1,000 resident in Wyandotte County. So in order for it to, if we did not increase any FTE, which this forecast assumes there is no additional FTE, we're actually saving money every year and becoming more efficient by not adding more FTE. But that per resident ratio would continue to decline. So if the goal were to remain at 14 FTE across the entire UG, we would have to add about 20 FTE every year in order to keep up with the growth or demand, for residents. So I just wanted you to know that even though we're not filling positions, and by not doing that, we're not adding new positions to the current base, and by doing that, we're becoming more and more efficient every year. We don't add positions, but if we did, this accounts for about 19 FTE every year for the next 10 years.
So I have a question on the deferred maintenance on existing facilities. Does that include expenditures for rehabilitating our fire stations? And does the new facilities for growing service demands, does that cover building new fire stations?
Okay, so our current CMIP includes the cost of the new fire stations as well as the rehab of the significant portion of our fire stations.
So the current CMIP does do that. So that's already built in.
Yeah, this is, I'm not sure if it includes absolutely 100% of everything the fire department would like to see, but it has a significant portion of fire investment, capital investment.
Okay.
Kathleen, I do have one question in reference to your deferred maintenance on existing facilities. And I'll ask staff to correct me, but somewhere along the line, I thought we were working on getting a handle on all of the assets that we own as a community. Has that been accomplished at this time? Do we now have a total inventory of all of our assets that we can look at not only the value of those assets, but the ongoing long-term maintenance and or financial obligation we have on those facilities?
But so I just want, I'm going to have Jeff Fisher answer that, but I did want you to know that it's very much in our work plan as Finance and Public Works to work towards that end, and we're excited about that project. Go ahead.
Right. We do have the partner on board now to go through that assessment. It'll take us maybe a year to really get a full assessment of the facilities. By this time next year, we should have a really good understanding of that.
So this gets to my $150 million question. Are we being conservative with that number, or are we being optimistic with that number of $150 million? If we really don't have a handle on our assets, I mean, are we just throwing darts here as to what our long-term maintenance, or are we just plugging in a number to give us?
I got the detail here. So okay, throwing darts. I would say a little bit of dart throwing, yeah. But generally, I'll say we've identified some roof and building envelope, water vapor and resistance materials and structural issues, mechanical, kind of HVAC and suppression, electric, plumbing, elevators, parking structure, lighting, all of those kind of areas were included in this $15 million.
And I can understand that we would have the existing facilities that we know we have as assets. My concern is the facilities that we don't have on record or that we're missing, that we haven't included in our asset management. Maybe I'm having maybe I have a different opinion as to what we should have as far as knowledge when it comes to our facilities for the unified government. It's not any different than we have on the state side. We don't know what we own until we take an inventory. And at times, those inventories haven't been accurately maintained, or they're not a priority, and it doesn't take but a handful of years before that inventory is not accurate. And so if we find a handful of facilities that belong to us and we're obligated to remedy those that we don't have in our asset portfolio, I'm just curious.
Yeah, I believe we have good confidence in the inventory of the assets.
Yeah.
The condition is the question, and I think John Kelly has a pretty good a feel for, this number is probably pretty solid, but slightly conservative, I'd say.
And I appreciate that statement. I think we did have a difference of opinion as to what we were talking about asset size. But what you just clearly stated is not what we own, it's the question of the condition of those facilities that we own.
Right.
I
Correct.
appreciate that clarification. Thank you.
All right, so the last slide is a question for all of you. So how do we grow the tax base and accumulate resources to support strategic priorities? So that's what we all want to talk about at the retreat that we're having on November 1st, so among other things.
And so this question, came out of just the situation we're in. We can see what it is we would like to do, what we need to do. And Commissioner Walters had raised the question, generally, what are we doing, for instance, with the master plan, let's say K32, K7? Are we activating those plans? Are those things we're using to actually look at this and say, well, if we're going to invest someplace, we need to do capital infrastructure. Let's say we were invested along K32, what kind of gains would we realize? Those are the kinds of questions we want to look at during the retreat and brainstorm. And we want to take a long-term view of this so we can provide some guidance to ourselves as we move forward. That's it.
All right, well, thank you. I think in just
I
to
have a
that point,
question.
Yes, Commissioner McGee.
noting, as we went through and Kathleen said tonight, this is not a plan, it's a forecast. Everything we threw up there were estimates about the strategies of different things we may want to fund. None of those are in the budget. Those are all just additional items we may want to build in the future, like the Parks Master Plan, or that there's been emphasis or been interest in those. So it just sets out ideas for things like that. And of course, as she said, it's a forecast as to how the revenues and expenses go. Our plans would be one where we would always try to balance the budget each year as we move forward.
Yes, Commissioner McGee.
Thanks, Mayor. So very good presentation by your team. Kathleen, it's a really good job. I have a question, and I think I know the answer, but I just want to ask it out loud. So all these areas, like the mayor had mentioned K32 and some other areas, you and I, Doug, have talked about the Rosedale KU Med area as it grows like crazy. We have some areas of our community that are great right now, opportunities for development. Do we have the staff that we need to look at these areas and really actively go out and market them for development?
So I'm going to ask, I think that's a great question that we need to bring up in our strategic planning.
Okay.
Because if we can identify strategies and ways to move forward, then we start saying, all right, now how do we implement that? And what resources do we need to bring to bear? Perhaps include more staffing, whatever it might be. Maybe more research, maybe more consulting to be able to identify really where is the best bang for our buck. So I think that's a perfect question for our.
Do we have that, Mayor? Do we know, does our staff know, does anyone know what areas of Wyandotte County the fair market is particularly interested in? I mean, I know in my district, because I'm commissioner and I'm in the weeds all the time, but does somebody on staff know areas of greatest opportunity in Wyandotte County for development? Do we know that?
And I think that's a great question for us for our retreat.
Well, if we could have the answer to that for our retreat, so we could discuss those locations that show the greatest amount of opportunity for, 'cause I agree with you, Mayor, when you say you look at that amount of debt that we can borrow as opportunity. I mean, I think that's what you were saying, and I agree with that. If it's invested right, it can be a great opportunity to grow our community. We have to make sure that we're using it for that and not to pay our bills, because that's not going to help us in the long run. But I always speak about my district because as long as I've been here, I've never heard a presentation, other than from other commissioners, highlighting areas that may have potential in our community. I've never seen a presentation that shows those areas that fair market developers might be interested in coming into and developing. I think we need that to be strategic.
Very good. So how much time do we need for our executive?
Until 7 o'clock, we
Okay.
convene our full
Okay. Do you have a motion for executive session for discussion of matters related to labor?
I move that the commission go into executive session until 7 p.m. to discuss confidential matters regarding the status and future direction of labor negotiations, all as justified under the employer-employee negotiations exception in the Kansas Open Meetings Act, and that staff designated by the county administrator be present to participate in the discussions, and that we reconvene in open session at 7 p.m. in the commission chamber located on the first floor.
We have a motion. Do you have a second? Need a roll call or just all in favor? All in favor? Aye.